Working nights has its good and bad sides. For many of my colleagues it is a change that no one wants to choose, dark, lonely and long, but for me it was always a period of peace. I don't know if it's the silence that comes from the sleeping city, the fresh air of the little morning when I take care of everything while the others rest. I have spent years following the same route and I already knew every part of this highway. It was an isolated section, and after midnight the only cars passing were truck driver or a tired driver trying to get through. That night it was 2 hours past and everything seemed normal. I was approaching a wide, well-known bend when in the distance I spotted an only pair of headlights. I was careful because I quickly realized that the car was moving too fast and that the headlights were shaking, dancing from side to side. It was strange. As the car passed me I saw it was swaying irregularly as if the driver was drunk or disoriented. I have decided to turn around and follow him. I turned on the Giroflex and tried to get closer, hoping that he would stop at the next exit to catch up with him. I realized that the situation seemed worse than what I imagined, the car making sudden movements, going from one voice to another, swerving as if the driver was not in full control of the vehicle. I accelerated further in keeping some distance and I waited for him to notice the emergency lights and stop, but to my great surprise he accelerated even more as if he was trying to run away. This put me in alert. One night like that the road was empty, a car was fleeing. It was not a good sign. I continued behind him trying to see who was driving, but the windows were too dark to distinguish anything. He kept the car unstable, almost out of control, and a smell of burnt rubber started to make itself felt. We came to a sharp bend and that's when it all happened. Quickly and almost inevitably the car skidded, left the asphalt, hit a barrier protection and lowered a small aluminum until stopping just as I was parked and got out of my car, keeping a safe distance but preparing to approach. First thing I noticed is that the engine was still running and the driver's door was open. The car was parked there at a strange angle with the driver's window broken and shards of glass scattered on the seat and the floor. I approached using the flashlight to illuminate the interior of the car. In the passenger seat was an open wallet, scattered papers and a cell phone. The screen was broken. Little by little I realized that something was seriously wrong. I looked around expecting to see the driver, perhaps injured, lying next to the car, but there was no one there. I looked inside the car again, lighting up every corner trying to figure out if he had managed to get out and hiding in the nearby trees. I picked up the radio and called for assistance, informing them of the accident and calling for backup to search for the driver. While I waited I continued to watch around me, scanning the area for any sign of footprints or tracks indicating where he might have been but the surrounding land was completely clear of grass and dirt showed only the tracks of the car's wheels, no other footprints, no sign that anyone had walked from there to somewhere. The silence was salty, only broken by the engine of the car that continued to roar as if it had been there for several minutes. It was as if the driver had just disappeared into thin air. After a few minutes my partner arrived and we performed together a more detailed analysis while he checked the car's papers and contacted the center for more information. I continued to look around hoping to find a clue. That's when he told me the car was registered to a man named Carlos Mia, but according to the system it was reported stolen and not recently. The car had disappeared 4 years ago and since then no one knew where she was at the time. The main suspect was Rafael Kors, a man with a history of petty crime and robbery. Rafael was a guy who never stayed anywhere and the police had tried to find him several times after the robbery, but it seemed to have disappeared from the map. There was no photo trace or any proof of where he could be now. Somehow his car was there, parked at the middle of the road as if it had come out of the past. The idea disturbed me. I looking at the car again, feeling that there was something very strange about the situation. Every business was there, wallet, cell phone and paper that looked old, yellowed by time. There was no logic in a car that had been missing for so many years appearing so empty and with the engine still warm in a place where no other vehicle had passed that night. We raise all the possibilities. Maybe it was another criminal, someone who took the car and fled when they saw the pursuit, but even if he was, where could he have gone? The field, the surrounding area was dense and bushy, and any movement left traces that did not exist. When the team forensics arrived, we had already done our preliminary searches, but they found nothing, nor who can explain the disappearance of the driver. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air, leaving behind only the car and a void that was difficult to explain to the police station. While we filled out the report, I tried to organize my thoughts, but nothing seemed to make sense on each line that I was writing. The script seemed even more surreal to me. Until now, all we had was a missing car, a criminal from 4 years ago, and a supposedly deserted road. The image of this empty parked car with the door open and things scattered on the seat but remained all morning, and one question kept resonating in my head as if I was waiting for an answer: where did he finish? After this early morning, the case of the car on the road began to affect me in a way that I didn't expect. It wasn't just the strangeness of the empty car or the missing driver, but the emptiness absolute, the uncomfortable feeling that something was out of place in a way that we couldn't explain to the police station. The case has been temporarily classified as an unsolved incident, that one of these things that happen and just go unanswered. But for me, this car has never left my mind. I tried to forget, I tried to rationalize, but in moments of silence this thought came back. I started looking at the road more often early in the morning, looking for any sign of something I might have missed the first time. Sometimes I would pass close to the exact location of the accident, even though I knew it was useless, just to make sure I didn't miss the open door scene of the engine still hot and things thrown on the ground. It was engraved in my memory like an image that I could never forget, could erase. A few weeks later, when I was back in office, soon something unexpected happened. It was one of those cloudy nights where the air was heavy as if a storm was coming. The highway was particularly deserted, quieter than usual. I was driving slowly, almost expecting something to happen, when suddenly the car radio started to fail. At first it was a slight hiss, but soon the sound became louder, as if there was interference. Intense. I tried to adjust the volume, but nothing worked. It was like if the sound came from far away, a metallic and incomprehensible echo. I was about to turn off the radio when for a moment I heard something that froze me, a voice. It was low, muffled, and hard to understand, but it sounded like someone at plant to lied. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, and I continued to listen, trying to pick up something else, but the voice disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, and the whistling took over the radio again. My heart pounding, I picked up the communication radio and asked them to check the frequency, but no anomalies were recorded at all. Seemed normal, at least to the people at the center. I tried to ignore what I had heard, but an uncomfortable feeling settled inside me, and I decided to move forward, hoping that the road would give me some answers. A few minutes later, as I was driving near the accident site, I saw something on the side of the road. There was a little reflection, as if something was shining in the headlights. I slowed down, and as I approached, I saw that there were pieces of glass scattered on the side of the road, almost invisible in the darkness. These fragments reminded me of the pieces of glass I had seen on the driver's seat weeks ago. Before I stopped the car, I went out with the flashlight, and I crouched down to keep a closer look. I knew it shouldn't be there. The medical examiners had cleared the area after the accident, and I had checked the scene myself, but now the pieces of glass were back to exactly the same place where the car had hit the barrier. What made me most uncomfortable was that in addition to the glass, I found partially crumpled sheets of paper. When I recovered one of the papers, I saw that it was a toll receipt dated the same night as from the accident. A feeling of agitation invaded me. These papers were the same that the ones I had seen on the car seat that morning. It was like someone had come back and had left there as a reminder of what had happened. I continued to search the area, but found nothing else. The silence was absolute, and the only sound was the wind passing over the deserted road. I returned to the car police, but the feeling of being watched did not disappear. My instinct told me to get out of there as quickly as possible. impossible, but something prevented me from leaving. I remained stopped with the engine running, observing the darkness around, waiting for something to reveal itself. After a few minutes the radio rang again. This time the interference was even louder, as if trying to get a message across. I stood still, listening to the shrill sound and chaotic, trying to make out a pattern, and again I heard the same voice. It was the same dull and distant tone, but now it seemed clearer. It was a short call, almost desperately repeating my name. It was a deep, harsh male voice. She looked desperate, as if she came from a very far away place, or as if she was stuck somewhere. The name was repeated over and over, and for a second I thought frozen. I knew it didn't make sense. No one knew I was at that exact spot on the road, and even if he knew, there was no reason for anyone to call me that on the car radio. I quickly turned the radio off, trying to regain control. It was impossible, I thought to myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow connected to something I couldn't understand. I looked at the clock on the dashboard and realized that it had been over half an hour since I had stopped there, but it felt like it had only been a few minutes. The air around me was getting thicker and thicker, and the feeling that there was something with me watching me was growing every second. Finally I started the car and got out of there, going back to the police station with my mind troubled and full of questions. I tried to explain to my colleagues what had happened, but they looked at me with skepticism. In the report I ended up putting some details, saying only that I had found glass and papers from the accident on the side of the road. When I returned at home I threw myself on the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. This voice that calls me, the repetition, the tone urgent and muffled, the voice still resonated in my head, as if it was trapped in a corner of my memory waiting to be remembered. I knew that from that night something had changed. The road I knew so well, the tranquility of the night shift, all this now seemed to me strange and threatening. After that night I started to avoid the section where the accident had happened. I didn't tell anyone, but the weight of this road emptied the car, and this voice on the radio kept bothering me. It was like something invisible was reminding me of a presence that I could not completely ignore, but despite all my efforts to push this feeling away, I couldn't avoid passing, at least from time to time, as if I needed to face this mystery. A few nights later, on a particularly cold day, I was on patrol when a feeling inexplicable that something was watching me came back to haunt me. It was something familiar, like a premonition, a kind of shadow that seemed to follow me. Since that night I knew that I was not alone, even if there was no sound, no movement around me. It was just the feeling that someone or something was there. I stopped the car on the hard shoulder and turned off the engine, only to hear the complete silence of the road. It was a few kilometers from the accident site, and for a moment I thought about it, to go back and see the places again, even though I knew I had already done it several times. The dark road and desert seemed to attract me, as if something was waiting for me to discover. I took a deep breath and turned around, guiding the vehicle to the exact spot of the accident. Collision marks were still visible on the crash barrier, and the tire panels were faded but still present on the road. I got out of the car and I stood there with my flashlight pointed at the spot where Raphael's car had rolled down the embankment and crashed against the fence. I observed every detail, waiting for a new clue to appear, but there was nothing. Suddenly the car radio blared again. This time it was clearer, and it wasn't a normal interference. A low, constant sound, almost like breathing, seemed to be coming from the device. I picked up the radio, pressed on the button to adjust the frequency, but the sound continued, and in a barely audible whisper I heard the same voice as before, now closer. It was no longer a call from my end, but a dull whisper, as if someone was trying to say something but was unable to form complete words. Panic began to set and invade me. I closed the radio and put it back in its holder, taking a deep breath and trying to stay calm. But then, as I looked at the road ahead, I noticed something that shouldn't not being there. In front of me a shadow was moving slowly, barely visible in the darkness, but clear enough so that I could make out a silhouette. I brought the flashlight closer and pointed it at the silhouette, but it disappeared as soon as the light hit it. I blinked, thinking it was my imagination, but when I lowered the flashlight, the figure was back, standing at the same place. It was like seeing a strange reflection, a presence that only existed when you were were not looking at it, not directly. It didn't make sense, but I couldn't look away. I took a deep inspiration and I took a few steps forward, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was a silhouette, indistinct, dark, but with human outlines. He didn't move. He stayed there in a position that made me feel like he was watching me. As I tried to get closer to the radio rang again, and this time the voice was crisp and clear, as if it was right next to me. It wasn't a call for help, but a short sentence spoken softly and urgently. "You shouldn't be here." Freezing, I felt my body frozen, and the cold that wasn't once the night air became an internal ice. This voice, although familiar, seemed inhuman, filled of a strangeness that chills your spine. I tried to answer, to ask who it was, but nothing came out. My throat was stuck and my mind was racing, trying to figure out what was going on. That's when the radio cut off, the whistling disappeared, and absolute silence returned. The figure that I saw began to fade like a shadow fading into the darkness. I took a few steps back without turning away the look until reaching the car. I got in the car and started the engine, coming out of there too as fast as possible without looking back. All the way back to the police station, my mind remained fixed on the voice I heard and on the sentence uttered, a sentence that resonated in my head like a final warning. Back at the police station, I sat at the table trying to organize my thoughts, but I couldn't understand what I had just seen and heard. It was all impossible. The voice, the silhouette, the radio that seemed to activate. It was like something from the past was trapped in that place, watching me, testing. I spent the rest of the shift trying to work normally, but I knew that something had changed. In the days that followed, I started having dreams of road accidents and a silhouette that had no face, just a presence, something dark and disturbing in every dream. The voice whispered the same words as if trying to get me off this road. "You shouldn't be here." I woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, with the feeling that somehow the road was still watching. This last night on patrol before being reassigned to another shift, I did a last bend in the road, but I avoided the scene of the accident. I knew that somehow I had left something behind, something I may never understand, and maybe this would be better this way, since I never came back on this path. The other policemen know that there was an accident there. They are aware of the reports of an empty car and property abandoned, but no one talks about what really happened on that road. It's like it's a collective secret of a memory that everyone prefers to ignore, and when it poses questions about this case, I'm just saying it was a common accident. After all, it's better to keep some things under silence. It was supposed to be a peaceful night like so many others in the old neighborhood where I patrolled. There were rarely any incidents. The residents were mostly elderly and the streets were practically deserted after 10 a.m. I was on my last tour before returning to the police station when I received a call on the radio about a possible break-in at an old house in a remote neighborhood. It was after 2 a.m. morning, and the description of the incident was quick and vague, just a strange movement that someone had seen since one of the windows, but nothing specific. The street where the house was located was dark, with a few lamps on and a row of trees that cast heavy shadows on the asphalt. As I approached, I recognized the house had an abandoned look, one of those old properties that seemed forgotten by time. The paint was discolored, the windows were dusty, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. In the yard, an old wooden swing hung from a gnarled tree and moved slightly in the wind. Got out of the car and walked slowly towards the entrance, feeling that the air was colder than in the surrounding streets. The main gate was closed but not locked. I gently pushed the door, waiting that it creaks, and I went inside, shining my flashlight. Inside, the house smelled musty, with a strong odor that resembled something stored for a long time. The silence was almost absolute, and the sound of my footsteps echoed on the parquet floor, which seemed unstable in places. The first thing what I noticed was the total absence of furniture. The house was empty, without furniture, no personal items, just peeling walls and dusty floor. I took a long corridor that led access to other parts of the house. On the ceiling, light bulbs were hanging on unraveled wires, and some doors were Ajar, revealing dark and empty rooms. I searched each room looking for signs of forced entry or footprints, but nothing seemed out of place. The feeling that someone had been there was strong, but there was no clue I could report. I was almost convinced that it was a false alarm, probably the result of a neighbor's imagination, when I saw something that made me stop. At the end of the corridor, a window was broken and shards of glass were scattered on the ground. The cold in the air increased as I approached, and the slight sound of something dragging came from the back of the house. I pointed the flashlight at the window and observed the reflection of the room. It is there in the mirror hanging on the wall that I noticed a quick movement, a shadow that seemed to pass from the other side. I have my heart racing, and I slowly approached, trying to get a better look. In the reflection of the mirror I saw only the empty corridor, but the feeling that there was something with me was undeniable. I inspected every corner, moving the flashlight, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. The hallway seemed too dark even with the light from the lamp pocket, and the silence was now almost oppressive. I continued the rotating sweep in the entrance hall and checking each room a second time. I crossed the living room and entered a bedroom that appeared to be the master bedroom, whose broken window was open. The dust accumulated on the floor seemed intact without any recent footprints. The reflection in the mirror was empty, showing only the light from the lamp pocket and a distorted image of the door. The strangest thing was the absence of any proof, even if it was a break-in. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints on the ground, and the dust didn't seem to have been disturbed. The feeling that something was wrong didn't go away, but I had nothing concrete to justify this feeling. I thought about going back to the car, but the feeling that there was something I hadn't seen yet made me hesitate. Looking around, I saw a staircase leading to an attic, the wood already worn and the steps covered in dust. It was an access narrow which seemed almost hidden in a corner of the wall. I climbed slowly, paying attention to the steps which creaked under my weight. When I got there, I found an empty and cramped space with no windows, just a low ceiling and some old boxes stacked in a corner. The smell was even stronger there, and for a moment I thought hearing a faint sound like a distant whisper. I checked the boxes, but they were locked and dusty. I went downstairs, feeling like I was overreacting by trying to find something that wasn't there. With every step he took outside, the feeling of being observed increased. Even without proof, I knew I was not alone in this house. I went back into the hallway, and I took one last look in the mirror, which continued to reflect the empty hallway behind me. Reflection seemed darker, more distorted, and the echo of my own footsteps seemed a little louder. I looked at the front door and decided it was time to leave. Without proof, without explanation, the house remained an unsolved mystery. I closed the door and I went back to the police car, but the image of the shadow in the mirror, the subtle sound and the sudden cold air remained in my mind. I couldn't explain it, but something in that house seemed to remain alive, even abandoned. After this visit home, I couldn't get rid of this place. It was something I never could not explain to my colleagues, and most of the details, like the movement in the mirror and the cold. Suddenly I was left alone. In the report I described the basic elements: the empty house, the broken window, and the untouched environment, but none of this reflected what I felt actually inside. In the days that followed, I did my best to keep this issue aside. But there was something I couldn't ignore. Every time I thought about the reflection, it seemed to me remembering more details. The shadow that had quickly spread across the mirror did not seem to be that a simple task or a light effect. It was something that had moved with determination, as if there was someone there trying to avoid being seen. A few days later I decided to go home in the day, hoping that with the sun the atmosphere would be different, less heavy. I did not go with the car. I wasn't even on duty. It was just an informal visit. I needed to know if this impression was a figment of my imagination or if there really was something I had missed. The neighborhood seemed even quieter in the daylight. I parked at a few meters from the house and I walked to the entrance, trying to remember exactly where I had stopped the first time. The door was still open, and when I opened it, the musty smell was still strong. The light coming from the windows revealed more signs of abandonment: peeling walls, dark corners, and canvas notices spider webs in the corners of the ceiling. During the day the house seemed even emptier, as if it had never not having had a visitor for years. I entered and went straight into the hallway where I had seen movement in the mirror. The mirror was there, reflecting the hallway with the same dirty and worn appearance. The broken window still had some shards of glass, but now with a thin layer of dust on top, indicating that no one had touched it since last time I was here. I walked down the hallway, checking every corner, trying to find a trace that would justify what I had seen. When I passed the window I felt the same cold as the first night. The air was thick and every step echoed uncomfortably. I looked at myself in the mirror again, hoping to see something, but the reflection only showed the empty hallway behind me with no signs of movement. I went in the master bedroom where the stairs to the attic were, and once again I felt the same weight. It was an empty room with no trace of presence, but there was something that seemed to be observed from afar, almost imperceptible, like a shadow. I decided to go up to attic even though I knew I was alone. The steps creaked like before, and when I got there I found the same dusty cardboard in the corner, but as I got closer I noticed something I've never seen before previously. In one of the boxes the lid was slightly dislodged, as if someone had moved it. The surrounding dust was intact, but the lid looked more clean without the buildup I expected. It was like someone had touched it recently. I opened it carefully, the box, and I found some old objects: yellowed papers, a broken pocket watch, and an old hand mirror with worn frame. There was nothing to explain what I had seen, but the mirror seemed strangely familiar to me, as if I had seen it before, perhaps in the mirror itself hanging on the wall of the corridor. I searched for a few more minutes, but I didn't found nothing concrete. I decided to go down and return to the living room. When I reached the hallway again, the atmosphere was heavier. The sunlight coming through the windows seemed dimmer, and the mirror reflected the hallway with a strange, almost dark tone. As I walked past the mirror I felt a change in temperature, and the reflection seemed distorted, as if I was being observed. And suddenly a dull noise echoed throughout the house. It was the sound of creaking wood coming from down the hall. I took a deep breath and followed the sound, but when I reached the master bedroom the silence took over again. The feeling of being watched was now louder with every step I took. The mirror seemed to reflect a darker and denser image, and the cold of the hallway enveloped me in a way that seemed almost physical. There was nothing else visible in the mirror but the reflection of the empty house, but the weight of this feeling made me hesitate to turn away. I remained standing still, staring at the reflection, waiting for something to appear, but nothing happened. As I left the house I felt a mixture of relief and unease. I knew something was wrong in this house, but I had no explanation or concrete evidence to prove it. The image of the shadow in the mirror, the dull sound, and the change in temperature continued to bother me. I returned to the car feeling of having left something unfinished in there, but at the same time a part of me didn't want to go back there. The following days I started having strange dreams about this house with the mirror and the dark reflection in the hallway. I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that something was watching me, a presence that even followed outside of this house. After this second visit to the house I decided not to return there, even though the place continued to bother me. A part of me knew that insisting wouldn't bring an answer clear. However, even without entering I started to do routine rounds on this street early in the morning. Every time I drove by the house the memory of the dark hallway and the reflection in the mirror came back with force, as if a part of me was trapped there. Over the next few weeks I began to notice subtle changes in my routine and movement were the same, and the neighborhood remained quiet, but I felt a constant presence, a shadow that seemed to haunt me, follow everywhere I went. Sometimes it was a distant sound, other times a quick reflection in the window of the car, but it was always something that disappeared before I could check. At first I thought that I was just paranoid because of my experience at home, but the signs started to become more frequent. One evening when it was already 2 a.m. I received a new call in the same street. The report was vague: a neighbor neighbor had declared having heard noises coming from the abandoned house. Despite the strangeness of the situation, I felt compelled to answering the call. I went home with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, trying to prepare myself for all I could find there. When I arrived, I parked in front of the house and observed for a moment the facade. There was no sign of movement or light, just the shadows of the trees cast by the dim street lighting. The door was closed, but to my surprise it is now locked. I stood there trying to understand how something like this could happen. I took a deep breath. I did the around the house and I headed towards the broken window that led to the back bedroom. With an effort I managed to get in through the window, and when I put my feet on the floor in the hallway I felt the same, colder than other visits. The house was quiet, but the air was cooler, thick, almost oppressive. I pointed the flashlight down the hallway and saw, followed slowly, crossing the same empty rooms. The mirror on the wall was always in the same place, and its surface dark reflected the hallway in a strange way, as if the green was darker than usual. While I was walking down the hallway I heard a thud coming from above. I looked at the ceiling and realized that the noise came from the attic. It was a light but repetitive sound, like something was scratching the wood. I thought to ignore, but the instinct to investigate won me over. I climbed the ladder slowly, the flashlight pointed upwards, hoping to find something. When I arrived, the attic was exactly as before, empty and covered in dust. The noise had stopped and silence was more oppressive than ever. I looked around, checking every corner, but there were only the old ones, boxes stacked. I decided to open one of the boxes, and this time I found objects that I didn't remember not having seen it before. Between the papers and old photos there was a frame with a piece of mirror, broken, similar to that of the corridor wall. I felt a freshness in realizing that the attic mirror seemed to reflect the same empty hallway, even though it wasn't pointed at him. I quickly ran down the stairs, trying to push away the feeling that something was watching. In passing the mirror in the corridor, I saw a movement in the reflection. It was fast, like a dark silhouette that had disappeared before I could see clearly. The reflection showed the empty hallway behind me, but this time a stain dark seemed to appear in the corner of the mirror, like a shadow, stopped but not defined. Feeling my heart racing, I tried to look away, but something made me keep looking in the mirror. Like I did observe, the task seemed to grow, taking up more space in the reflection until the figure of a person begins to form. It was not someone I recognized, but the feeling of familiarity was intense. The figure seemed to face me even without a face, a dark and no definition that seemed filled only by emptiness. The image suddenly disappeared, leaving only the reflection of the empty hallway. I took a few steps back, trying to control my breath, and I left as fast as I could, going out the back window and away from the house. I looked back one last time and thought I saw something moving through the window, broken like a shadow that dissolved into darkness. I returned to the car and continued sitting for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. None of it made any difference. Feel the mirror, the figure, the shadow that seemed to follow me. The silence was absolute, and the weight of that experience was with me, as if the house had left a mark on me. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind preaching plays, but I knew deep down it wasn't only an impression. Since this night I have not returned to this street. The night patrols were tense, and I began to feel that there was something following me. A presence that seemed to manifest itself in reflexes and shadows, but which were never directly proven. I began to avoid mirrors and reflexes at dawn, as if he once again feared that dark figure in the corner of the vision. A few weeks later, while passing near this area, I learned that the house had been sold. The new residents have reported problems since day one, with strange sounds and a feeling of being observed, but no one could explain why. For me, there was only the memory of the reflection in the mirror, the shadow in the hallway, and the intense cold that made me realize that all the places abandoned are not really empty.